Hello, friend. Welcome back to the Renaissance English History Podcast, a part of the Agora Podcast Network and the original Tudor History Podcast, telling stories of Tudor England since 2009. I am your host, Heather. Today, we are going to talk about Jacquetta of Luxembourg. So, if you watch or read any of the Philippa Gregory books about the White Queen, the Red Queen, all the various different colors of queens, you ran into Jacquetta. And that is how I first learned about her when I read and watched the Stars series. Gosh, how long ago was that? Like a long, long time ago. And, I've said this before, a lot of people have kind of mixed thoughts about Philippa Gregory. And the one thing I'm not a fan of the way she treats Lady Margaret Beaufort. So there's that right off the bat. But I do love that she's gotten so many people interested in Tudor history and, wanting to dig deeper and wanting to learn more. And so that is definitely a positive. I'm not a fan when people get into arguments about historical things and they say, well, in the Philippa Gregory book, I read blah, 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 because, that kind of makes you cringe a little bit. But that's not her fault that people do that. So I can't blame her for that. Anyway, Jacquetta is one of those women that was so prominent and played such a huge role and is fortunately getting a lot more attention thanks to Philippa Gregory and some other research that's been done too. It's not just her. But so we're gonna do an episode on her today and talk about her. And of course, she is kind of outside of the Tudor period. But her granddaughter was the Queen of England and her great-grandson was Henry VIII, so she obviously has a role to play there. So one quick note, I am opening up the call for speakers for TudorCon. If you have a talk or a presentation, an idea for something you'd like to present at TudorCon 2025, please let me know. Please fill out the form. We have a form, so things are very official. We have a form and a committee that looks over all of the applications and decides who to invite and everything like that. But please, please, please fill out the form and, any idea you have. We are open to all kinds of crazy ideas. So I will link to the form in the show notes for this episode down below. So you have that, but certainly you are welcome. October 3rd through 5th at Agecroft Hall in Richmond, Virginia is where TudorCon 2025 is happening. October 3rd through 5th. The link is in the show notes, and we would love to see your idea, and we look forward to reading it. All right, today we are diving into the life of Jacquetta of Luxembourg, a woman whose story is packed with love, scandal, myth, and survival. Born into one of Europe's oldest and most noble families, Jacquetta wasn't content to simply play by the role society expected of her. Instead, she made her mark as a duchess, a scandalous bride, and eventually the mother of a queen. Jacquetta's life was wrapped in legend. Her family claimed descent from Melusina, a water goddess said to have cursed her descendants. Whether that myth influenced the accusations of witchcraft that Jacquetta later faced, we can't say for sure, but the connection adds another layer of intrigue to her story. And what a story it is. Jacquetta was the great-grandmother of Henry VIII, the mother of Elizabeth Woodville, and through her descendants, a direct ancestor of every English monarch since the Tudors. She defied royal orders to marry for love. She saw her family rise to the heights of power, and she survived some of the most tumultuous decades in English history. Her journey was far from easy. Her life intersected with the great events of her time, from the 100 Years' War to the Wars of the Roses. She faced accusations of witchcraft at a time when such charges could mean death. Yet through it all, she remained resilient, ensuring her family's legacy while navigating a world that often sought to destroy women like her. So in this episode, we're going to talk about the life of Jacquetta, from her noble beginnings to her role in shaping the Tudor dynasty. We'll talk about her ties to Melusina, to that legend, her controversial marriage to a knight, and the witchcraft accusations that threatened her. Jacquetta of Luxembourg was born around 1416 into one of the most prestigious families in Europe. Her father, Peter of Luxembourg, was the Count of St. Paul, Conversano, and Brienne, titles that stretched across modern-day France and Italy. Her mother Margaret de Beau came from a similarly illustrious background. If you follow her family tree, you'll find it littered with connections to royalty, including descent from Charlemagne and England's King John. Her heritage made her a valuable political pawn, but her story shows that she was far more than just a pawn. We don't know a lot about her early years, of course, as a girl, but her childhood was undoubtedly shaped by the ongoing conflict of the Hundred Years' War. France was caught between English and French claims to the throne, and power shifted constantly. The Luxembourg family was well placed in the middle of it all, allied with England during Jacquetta's youth. It was a dangerous, uncertain time, but Jacquetta's early exposure to these political dynamics likely prepared her for the upheavals that she would face later on in her life. Her uncle, John of Luxembourg, played a particularly influential role. He was a key military leader during the war and was infamous for his role in capturing Joan of Arc. For months, Joan was held at John's castle before being handed over to the English, who ultimately executed her. There is no record of Jacquetta meeting Joan, but it's hard to imagine that she wouldn't have heard about her. Joan's rise and tragic fall sent a clear message to women: step out of line and the consequences could be deadly. Her upbringing likely included a refined education, preparing her for the roles of wife and noblewoman. She would have learned skills like embroidery, music, and perhaps some basic reading and writing, though she did later demonstrate a more advanced understanding of literature and learning than many women of her time. This curiosity defined her, especially as she found herself in circles where books and ideas were valued. She lived at a time when the printing press was being invented and disseminated throughout Europe. Her son would actually bring the printing press to England, so she was definitely a part of that group. But Jacquetta's family also carried with them a myth. The Luxembourgs claimed descent from Melusina, a water goddess cursed to transform into a serpent from the waist down every Saturday. According to legend, Melusina married a mortal under the condition that he would never spy on her during her transformation. When he inevitably broke that promise, she left him, but not before cursing her descendants with tragedy and transformation. This legend wasn't just a family story, it was a huge part of Jacquetta's identity. The tale tied her lineage to the supernatural, painting her family as something otherworldly, both powerful and cursed. This myth might have been a point of pride, but it also set the stage for future accusations of witchcraft. After all, when a woman defied expectations or rose too high, myths and whispers could easily become weapons. Jacquetta's life would reflect the themes of the Melusina legend. She faced moments of transformation, becoming a duchess and then a commoner's wife, and finally the mother of a queen. And like her legendary ancestor, she experienced tragedy, including the loss of loved ones and the shadow of suspicion. Even as a young girl, Jacquetta must have felt the weight of her family's legacy. She was part of this lineage that claimed divine and royal connections. This combination of myth, nobility, and then the harsh realities of war set the stage for the life that she would lead, a life where history and legend were deeply intertwined. At the age of 17, Jacquetta's life changed dramatically when she married John of Lancaster, the Duke of Bedford. John was one of the most powerful men in England, serving as regent of France for his young nephew, Henry VI. As the younger brother of Henry V, John was tasked with upholding English control in France, a mission that defined his life. Marrying Jacquetta was meant to strengthen his political position, but the union would shape Jacquetta's life in ways she couldn't have foreseen. The marriage took place in April of 1433, just 5 months after the death of John's first wife, Anne of Burgundy. This quick remarriage caused some tension with John's former Burgundian allies, who saw it as disrespectful. Nevertheless, Jacquetta stepped into her role as the Duchess of Bedford with grace. At just 17, she became one of the highest-ranking women in England and France, second only to Queen Catherine of Valois and the Dowager Queen in the English royal hierarchy. After their marriage, Jacquetta and John traveled to Paris, where she was introduced to the intricate world of English-controlled France. They initially lived in the Hôtel de Bourbon, a residence near the Louvre. It was here that Jacquetta was exposed to her husband's famous library, which contained works on alchemy, religion, and natural sciences. This collection may have sparked Jacquetta's own intellectual curiosity. The Duke's interest in the mystical and intellectual realms perhaps later fueled suspicions about Jacquetta's own practices, particularly when she was accused of witchcraft. Despite her elevated status, Jacquetta's life with John was far from stable. The 100 Years' War raged on, and the English grip on France was weakening. In 1435, John's alliance with Burgundy collapsed when the Duke of Burgundy shifted his allegiance to the French crown. This political blow, combined with John's deteriorating health, marked the beginning of the end for Jacquetta's time as the Duchess of Bedford. On September 14, 1435, after just over 2 years of marriage, John died in Rouen. At 19, Jacquetta was a widow, but she wasn't left empty-handed. John's will granted her a significant dower, including a generous income and the right to remain a duchess. She also inherited John's library. However, Jacquetta's future was now under the control of Henry VI, who required her to seek royal permission before remarrying, a stipulation that would become pivotal in her next chapter. Jacquetta's first marriage positioned her at the heart of English and French politics. Though brief, her time as the Duchess of Bedford introduced her to the complexities of power and survival. The knowledge she gained during these years would serve her well in the tumultuous decades to come. But it wasn't long before Jacquetta's independent spirit led her to make a choice that shocked the English court and cemented her reputation as a woman who followed her heart. After the death of her first husband, Jacquetta might have expected to be used as a political pawn once again. At 19, she was a wealthy and titled widow, and as a member of King Henry VI's extended family, her future was tightly controlled by royal prerogative. Any future marriage required the king's permission. But Jacquetta had other plans. Instead of waiting for a politically advantageous match, she followed her heart, marrying Sir Richard Woodville, a knight of relatively modest means. This match was not only unconventional, it was actually quite scandalous. Richard Woodville had served as a squire and chamberlain to Jacquetta's late husband. He was young, handsome, and charming, but he was not the kind of man a duchess was expected to marry. How their romance began is unclear, but given the time they spent together in France, it's easy to imagine how they might have fallen in love. What we do know is that sometime before March of 1437, they married in secret without the required royal permission. When news of their marriage reached the court, it caused an uproar. Jacquetta's decision to marry beneath her station was seen as a defiance of social and political norms. The King's Council, which had been considering Jacquetta's value as a potential diplomatic bride, were furious. She and Richard were summoned to face the consequences for their actions. The couple was fined £1,000, a staggering amount at the time, and stripped of Jacquetta's dower lands. However, Jacquetta was no stranger to navigating the royal court, and she skillfully petitioned Henry VI for forgiveness. By October of 1437, they received a royal pardon, and Jacquetta's lands were restored. Despite the rocky start, the marriage was a very strong and loving partnership. Unlike her first marriage, which had been a duty-bound union to a much older man, Jacquetta and Richard's relationship was based on mutual affection. They settled at Grafton Regis in Northamptonshire, where they made their home. Over the years, they would have 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters, a remarkable number even for the time. Among them was Elizabeth Woodville, who would later marry King Edward IV and become the Queen of England. The Woodville family's rise to prominence was slow but steady. Richard's career flourished under Henry VI's reign, and in 1448 he was elevated to the peerage as Baron Rivers, a title that lifted him into the nobility. Jacquetta's influence at court, particularly through her close relationship with Margaret of Anjou, undoubtedly played a role in her husband's advancement. The couple became loyal supporters of the Lancastrian cause, and Jacquetta often served in the Queen's household in various roles. Their love story was not without its risks. By choosing Richard, Jacquetta had jeopardized her position and her wealth. The love match that scandalized the court ultimately produced a dynasty that would change England forever. By the mid-15th century, England was at a breaking point. The Wars of the Roses, the dynastic struggle between the Lancastrian and Yorkist factions, dominated politics, splitting loyalties, turning allies into enemies. As a loyal supporter of the Lancastrian king and his formidable wife, Margaret of Anjou, Jacquetta found herself deeply entangled in this violent upheaval. Jacquetta and her husband stood firmly on the Lancastrian side, loyalty coming not only from political ties but also from personal relationships. Jacquetta had been a close confidant of Queen Margaret since the young Frenchwoman's arrival in England in 1445. The two women shared similar noble backgrounds, and Margaret relied on Jacquetta for advice and support as she sought to maintain her husband's fragile reign. Henry VI, known for his piety and gentleness, was ill-equipped to rule. His bouts of catatonia, his mental health left the kingdom in a state of disarray, and Margaret often stepped in to lead the Lancastrian faction. Jacquetta, with her experience and steady presence, was a vital ally in the Queen's efforts to hold the kingdom together. But their alliance came at a cost. By the late 1450s, tensions between the Lancastrians and the Yorkists, led by Richard, Duke of York, had escalated into open conflict. In 1459, Richard Woodville was ordered by Queen Margaret to prepare a fleet at Sandwich to support the Lancastrian army. Jacquetta joined him there along with their eldest son Anthony, but before they could act, Yorkist forces struck. It was a daring raid led by the Earl of Warwick's captain. Yorkist soldiers stormed the port and captured the Woodvilles and dragged them from their beds. Jacquetta and Anthony were sent back to England, but Richard was taken to Calais, where Warwick and Edward, Earl of March, later Edward IV, humiliated him publicly. Though released without charges, this event showed just how precarious the Woodvilles' position had become. As the conflict deepened, the Woodville family remained staunchly Lancastrian. Jacquetta's daughter Elizabeth married Sir John Grey, a committed Lancastrian knight. However, the 1461 Battle of Taunton, a brutal clash that solidified Edward IV's hold on the throne, proved devastating for the Lancastrian cause. John Grey was killed in battle, leaving Elizabeth a widow with two young sons. Around the same time, Jacquetta's husband and eldest son were captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London, although Edward IV eventually pardoned them, likely thanks to Jacquetta's own diplomacy. With the Yorkists now empowered, Jacquetta faced an impossible situation. Her family had been loyal to the defeated Lancastrian regime, but survival required pragmatism. Jacquetta adjusted to the new reality, fostering a cautious relationship with Edward. This shift became even more critical in 1464, when her widowed daughter Elizabeth married the Yorkist king in a secret ceremony. The union was a shock to the court, but for Jacquetta, it was a remarkable turn of fortune. Once again, her family was at the center of power, and Jacquetta herself became the Queen Mother, a position of immense influence. However, Jacquetta's sudden rise didn't come without consequences. The Woodville family's rapid ascent bred resentment among Edward's court, particularly from his former allies like Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. In 1469, Warwick rebelled against Edward and seized control of the government. During this brief period of upheaval, Jacquetta's husband and son were captured and executed by Warwick's forces. Warwick's rebellion also saw Jacquetta accused of witchcraft. A man named Thomas Wake, likely acting under Warwick's orders, accused her of using witchcraft to manipulate Edward into marrying Elizabeth. Wake claimed to have found lead figures, one resembling the king and another resembling Elizabeth, on Jacquetta's estate. He alleged that these figures had been used in rituals to cast a spell on Edward, ensuring he would fall under Elizabeth's control. The claim played into widespread fears about the supernatural and the idea that women, especially powerful ones, could wield dangerous, unseen forces. Jacquetta immediately denied the accusations and took swift action to defend herself. She appealed to the Lord Mayor of London and other influential figures, emphasizing her long-standing service to the crown and the baselessness of the charge. Her strategy worked, at least temporarily. By early 1470, the charges were dropped because of lack of evidence. This was a remarkable outcome, given that witchcraft trials often ended with the accused burned at the stake. It's possible that Jacquetta's high status, powerful allies, and the return of Edward to power all contributed to her acquittal. But the accusations didn't end with her vindication. Years later, after Jacquetta's death, the charges resurfaced during the reign of Richard III. Richard, in his bid to legitimize his claim to the throne, declared Edward's marriage to Elizabeth invalid, claiming it had been brought about through witchcraft. He implied that both Jacquetta and Elizabeth had used dark arts to ensnare the king. However, Richard produced no evidence, and the allegations were widely seen as a political ploy to discredit the Woodville family. The witchcraft accusations against Jacquetta were as much a reflection of her enemies' desperation as they were of the era's fear of powerful women. Her connection to the myth of Melusina also likely added fuel to the fire. The legend of her family's supernatural origins may have seemed harmless in peacetime, but during moments of political instability, it became a convenient excuse to target her. Jacquetta of Luxembourg's legacy is most evident in her children and the roles they played shaping England's history. Her daughter Elizabeth became the Queen of England as the wife of Edward IV, while her son Anthony, Lord Rivers, stood out as one of the most interesting figures of the late 15th century. Elizabeth's marriage to Edward catapulted the Woodville family to prominence, a transformation that Jacquetta played a central role in orchestrating. As Elizabeth's mother, Jacquetta became a powerful figure at court, using her position to secure advantageous marriages and opportunities for her children. However, this rise brought the family many enemies, and the Woodvilles were often accused of wielding undue influence over Edward. Anthony Woodville, Jacquetta's oldest surviving son, emerged as a scholar, diplomat, and a patron of the arts. He was an early supporter of printing in England and is credited with translating and publishing several important works, including the Dictates and Sayings of the Philosophers, one of the first books printed in England. Anthony also played a crucial role in supporting his nephew Edward V after the death of Edward IV in 1483. As one of the key figures entrusted with the young king's guardianship, Anthony represented the Woodville family's continued influence. However, this position made him a target for Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who would later become Richard III. One of Richard's first acts in his bid for the throne was to arrest Anthony and execute him without trial. Anthony's death marked a turning point, signaling the end of Woodville dominance and the rise of Richard III. Jacquetta's other children made notable marriages, aligning themselves with powerful families across England. Mary, her daughter, married William Herbert, the second Earl of Pembroke. You will likely recognize the Herbert family name later on. During Elizabeth's reign, we talk about Mary Sidney Herbert, for example, the Countess of Pembroke, who was a poet and translator and patron of the arts. So she, of course, comes from Jacquetta. There was also Catherine Woodville, who married Henry Stafford, the second Duke of Buckingham. And then Catherine remarried Jasper Tudor, uncle of Henry VII. Catherine's first marriage, though, to Henry Stafford, led to the Stafford family, all of those Dukes of Buckingham that we hear about later. There was Lionel Woodville, who became Bishop of Salisbury and was highly regarded as a scholar and a clergyman. Through these connections, Jacquetta's descendants became intertwined with the Tudor dynasty and the future of the English monarch. She died on May 30th, 1472, likely at her family home in Grafton Regis. She was about 56, and the exact circumstances of her death are unclear, but it's evident that she had lived an extraordinary life with highs and crushing losses. Her final resting place is unknown, a mystery that does add a layer of intrigue to her story, much like the Melusina myth. Jacquetta's life, of course, shows the turbulence of 15th century England, but it also shows a figure who shaped the political and cultural landscape of her time, ensuring her family's survival and success in a period where so much was beyond her control. So there we have it, a little bit about Jacquetta of Luxembourg. If you want to dig in more to her, there's a very good book that I read called Royal Witches. It's by Gemma Holman. It's Royal Witches, Witchcraft and the Nobility in 15th Century England. Highly recommend that you check that out. I will also throw a link to that in the show notes. Okay, friends, remember, if you have any ideas about TudorCon, actually, in the very first TudorCon in 2019, Christine Morgan did a talk on Melusina and the myth of Melusina. So you know what? I will also put a link to that in the show notes as well for you to check out. So many notes, so much interconnectedness here with Jacquetta of Luxembourg. All right. Thank you so much for listening. I will be back again next week. Have a fantabulous day. I will speak with you soon. All right. Bye-bye.
Blow, northern wind, a scent will make me sweating. Blow, northern wind, blow, blow, blow. Ich hatte Bord in Bauerbrick, dat soll is semlis on sea.